Hello and welcome to News in Depth here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. The coalition of the willing is meeting shortly in Paris at the Élysée Palace to finalise security guarantees for Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire with Russia. US President Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner are also attending the summit. A draft statement indicates that allies are prepared to make binding commitments to support Kyiv if Russia attacks again. Joining us to explore this development is Susanna Jurek, defence correspondent at TVP World. Susanna, welcome back. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
Coalition of the willing. I mean,
right.
It's, what's it all about? Just briefly, what's it all about?
Right, so it's over 30 countries that have come together in order to ensure stable and steadfast support for Ukraine. They've been involved with Ukraine and supporting Ukraine since the early days of the war. It's led by Germany and France, and they kind of are responsible for ensuring that Ukraine has, sufficient air defenses, for example, that there is political will to continue supporting Ukraine. So it's both military and political support for the country.
Okay, so a group of countries offering that kind of support. Right. Now, I have a quote. Apparently, they come from the draft statement released by the coalition. I'll just read out a couple of sentences. European allies would commit to politically and legally binding guarantees to protect Ukraine in the case of a future armed attack by Russia in order to restore peace. This is part of what the draft said. And it goes on to say these commitments may include the use of military capabilities, intelligence and logistical support, diplomatic initiatives, adoption of additional sanctions. Now, that sounds pretty robust. Here's the question. Why do we need it? We have countries like, we have the NATO grouping, of course, which can coordinate such effects, such support. We have promises by France and the UK and the US as well, to an extent, to put security guarantee troops, if you like, on the ground in Ukraine. Why do we need this?
Well, crucially, I think you've touched on a point about the NATO alliance, for example, and I think, Ukraine is not part of the NATO alliance. And in fact, throughout the peace negotiations, Russia has been quite adamant about excluding any potential membership for Ukraine in the NATO alliance in the future as well. So this would be a way of kind of formalizing support for Ukraine after any potential peace agreement. This would be divided kind of because there is, nuances in the willingness of individual member states of the coalition of the willing. So the US is famously quite skeptical in terms of, military or ongoing military support for Ukraine. It has made a point of ensuring that it's the Europeans who are responsible for military support for Ukraine. So from what we know, the US would primarily be responsible for monitoring and verification following a ceasefire, whereas the European member states or the European partners in the coalition of the willing, they would be the ones who are responsible for ongoing support for Ukraine, for these kind of on-the-ground security guarantees, namely putting potential boots on the ground, ongoing, land, air and sea fortifications in Ukraine. But this is primarily, a formalization of security guarantees which Ukraine needs in order to come to a ceasefire in the first place. Okay,
now that's fine. You mentioned the US, and let's focus on that for a second. Jared Kushner was there, Steve Witkoff was there representing the US, and this is a legally binding agreement. Does that mean that the US is saying, yeah, we will definitely support this process because we're putting, we're signing this document? I mean, does it get rid of some of the uncertainty around the US's response?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it gets rid of the uncertainty because we know that the Trump administration has kind of gone back and forth in terms of what it is willing to offer.
Yeah, but they've never signed anything. This is legally binding.
Well, but what we also know from previous instances of legally binding documents that have been put forward for Ukraine in order to ensure that, there is a peace in place, whether it be the Budapest Memorandum of 1991, when Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear arsenal, or whether it be the Minsk agreements, we know that just because it's legally binding doesn't mean that it's going to be effective. So in a way, the US has previously, in the past, over the last 30 years, since, the fall of the Soviet Union, has made consecrated commitments to Ukraine, and this hasn't really transpired into any action when the push came to shove, really.
Okay, so let's then talk. You say that the US isn't going to commit to boots on the ground necessarily, but other types of. What are the other countries committing to?
Well, so this is actually one of the things that European countries are quite willing to offer. So, for example, we know that France, since the beginning of this year, really has been quite adamant about the fact that they are willing to put boots on the ground. And we similarly know that the Baltic states are willing to do the same. Namely, Estonia has previously made commitments. Just last month, it has made commitments that it is also willing to send its soldiers. And similarly, but even then, there are countries in Europe which are also quite skeptical of doing the same. But
they are part of the coalition of the willing, the sceptical countries.
They are. Poland, for example, is one of them.
Right, okay. We'll come to Poland in just a second. But I need to interrupt because, when you say sceptical countries, immediately what comes to mind is Hungary, Slovakia, and so on, and now perhaps even the Czech Republic. But all three of those are part of the coalition of the willing, aren't they? So if they're prepared to be legally bound by this agreement, are those countries going to put boots on the ground as well, then?
Well, no, because there are different ways in which they can support Ukraine going forward as well. Just because there's going to be military support going forward for Ukraine after a ceasefire is reached doesn't necessarily mean that it will mean boots on the ground to begin with. So this could be, for example, Czech Republic could potentially support or continue to deliver ammunitions for Ukraine. They could maybe pass on some of their air capabilities. So, for example, fighter jets if they wanted to, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they would also be sending their own personnel, particularly that from, as far as I'm aware, there isn't also much willingness in those countries to, be as robust in support for Ukraine as well after a ceasefire.
All right. Okay. So you raise a number of points. Let's start with the reaction of the populations of each of these countries. Which countries have a bit of a conflict between commitments like this and what their populations say?
Well, on a broader spectrum, I think, generally speaking, the idea of sending soldiers from European countries to Ukraine is fairly unpopular in a sense of, what it could mean for our own security going forward in the future. But I think specifically one of the starkest examples is Poland, where on the one hand we are very strongly committed, particularly on the government side, on the ruling government side, we are very committed to continuing to support Ukraine. But on the other hand, we have been very straightforward about the fact that we're not going to put boots on the ground. Even, from as early as the beginning of 2025, we have denied the possibility of putting soldiers or sending soldiers to Ukraine. And similarly, I think that reflects the societal kind of attitudes, right? People are still very adamant or people are still, receptive to the idea that our own security rests on the security and stability of Ukraine. But at the same time, I think over 80% of population in Poland, I think the most recent poll was 86%, is unwilling to send soldiers to Ukraine, because we also understand that as a frontline state, for example, if there was any, detriment to our own security environment, we would need those soldiers here, number one, and number two, with Poland serving as a logistical hub for Ukraine and having had done so since the beginning of the war, we know that we also have, critical infrastructure and critical logistical hubs, which would also need to be sheltered. And so we would have to have forces on the ground in order to shelter those.
To protect those.
Correct.
And those would be supporting the boots on the ground that actually exist, right, with the material going in there. Now the other, of course, the other slight conflict in Poland is between the president and the prime minister. We often hear opposing views on issues such as this. How does that affect the dynamic of kind of how Poland's position in the coalition of the willing?
Well, I think that's you've actually touched on a very important point, and that is since the beginning of the war, Poland has been recognized as one of the key countries when it comes to leading, the responses to the war in Ukraine. And since the election of the right-wing president, Karol Nawrocki, who I think tried to carve out a path for himself in shaping the country's foreign policy, there has been a conflict in how Poland actually perceives Ukraine. So on the one hand, we continue to have the same centrist government, which is very adamant about the need to support Ukraine. They have been very, consistent in their support for Ukraine. But on the other hand, Karol Nawrocki, he was a candidate who, throughout his campaign, championed this very Ukraine skeptic view, Eurosceptic as well, but primarily Ukraine skeptic view. And he oftentimes invoked the same sentiments that, for example, US President Donald Trump has done. And that is, for example, when Trump and Zelensky met in the White House a couple of months ago, and during this explosive argument in the Oval Office, or in the White House, that was when Trump accused Zelensky of not being grateful, similarly to J.D. Vance. They both accused him. They did this whole thing about Ukraine not being grateful enough for the support that they have received for Ukraine. And recently, Nawrocki has also, mirrored that sentiment. So, for example, him and Zelensky met in Warsaw at the end of December, where, despite the fact, and this was actually one of the most surprising things, so it seemed that Nawrocki, despite the worries that surrounded that exchange and potential fallout of that exchange, he actually appeared very diplomatic. He reaffirmed the fact that Poland as a whole is committed to supporting Ukraine, and we recognize Ukraine's security as a guarantee of our own security. But at the same time, he did also say, but on the other hand, Ukraine has not been grateful enough for the support that they have received. So this, going back to your question, I think this going back and forth between who's leading Poland's foreign policy on an international scene, but more broadly, where does Poland stand with this oscillation by the president as well, has kind of doubted the stability of Poland as a voice in the coalition of the willing to some extent.
Right. Well, you see, so now we're getting a bit of a sense of the bigger picture, because although at first glance it seems like, a firm security guarantee of some description, with all these countries involved and committed, we see that there are ruptures, both between countries and within countries on this. So how robust and resilient this agreement turns out to be is another issue. Now, what about the Russian response to this? You mentioned that, they've been very adamant from the beginning. We don't want NATO on our borders. Of course, ironically, they got Finland, who joined NATO after their invasion of Ukraine. But this is, I suppose, a NATO watered down version, if you like, European and other countries' version of NATO, because most of these countries are NATO countries.
Right.
And there will be boots on the ground. So in essence, it's like having NATO on the ground, isn't it?
Well, it is and it isn't. So we know that the US has, for example, and this was the strongest commitment that they've put forward so far, when they said that Ukraine could receive Article 5-like security guarantees after a ceasefire. But what that would actually mean is uncertain. And also, we know that the only way to really guarantee security for Ukraine would be to have this threat or for Russia to have a risk of a potential military response. But we don't know whether there would be a military response. Famously, we also know that, for example, when it even comes to its own security, NATO has had some issues over the last couple of years when it comes to an agreement of understanding or, calling threats and deciding on a threat perception in the region, for example. We recently had quite a lot of criticism leveraged against the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, where there were repeated instances of, for example, drone incursion into Poland's airspace in September, and latterly the incursions by fighter jets into Estonia's airspace. And then, the kind of drones circulating airports over in Copenhagen and Berlin, or Germany, in Munich, I believe it was. And even then, when he was asked repeatedly about the intentionality of this, because it can't be a coincidence if it happens multiple times, he still refused to say intentional, or he still refused to, number one, say whether it was Russia for sure, and number two, whether it was intentional, which to any observer, it seemed most likely to be the case.
Well, this is somewhat concerning. I mean, if NATO can't define a threat, as you say, threat perception, then how on earth is it going to be able to define a response?
Well, no, so it can define a threat. I think it's a question of diplomacy to some extent, to Mark Rutte's, credit. I think the risk of basically saying this was Russia and therefore we have to react means that, then NATO has to react, right? I mean, the only reaction that it can basically then have is symmetrical responses, which would basically mean an all-out war with Russia, which I don't think anybody wants right now, and I don't think the Russians want it, I don't think NATO wants it. So I think that's
I think the danger with that, of course, is that Russia is constantly pushing the boundaries to see how far it can go, and it keeps attacking the Baltics and European countries and gets away with it. I mean, what's the happy medium here? Where does NATO say, well, no, hang on, here's the red line, not going beyond that, or we will respond in some way?
Right, well, I think that's the difference, because we know what the red lines are quite clearly, but that's why we're saying that we are at a hybrid war with Russia, because they're not sending, troops to our borders. They're not doing any of that. They're not like bombing us or anything like that, which would definitely merit a response, and a symmetrical response. Instead, we have these kind of, I wouldn't say lukewarm, but almost lukewarm attacks, these provocations, this kind of pushing of a boundary to say how far they can actually go. And that is the difference. So dealing with these kinds of threats is very different, because dealing with, being at war is very different than being what actually the Commissioner of EU Defence and Space has termed time for preparedness. So we have to prepare for war, but we are not yet at war with Russia.
Well, you see, I think Russia would probably disagree with you. There are so many indications that it believes it's at war with Europe, NATO, and everybody else, it would seem. But if you look at, for example, how they're destroying undersea cables in the Baltic states, right? Now, that means that all of Europe could be disconnected in terms of all kinds of transactions, information flows, coordination, all of that. Now, that is an act of war. And yet, no one is prepared to say, well, yes, it was Russia doing this. And by the way, what are we going to do with these ships that are destroying these undersea cables? I mean, there doesn't even seem to be some kind of coordinated and firm response to what these ships are doing.
So I would actually disagree with you there, because there is a coordinated response, and that was NATO-led initiative. That's the Baltic Sentry, and it's a policing, monitoring mission on the Baltic Sea. And at the same time, individual countries which are being affected by these sabotage attempts, by these sabotage actions, they have called out the guilt being with Russia. And they have, in fact, in Finland, there was a trial of one of the first instances, or the loudest, the most prominent instances of this cutting of telecommunication cables. So the crew of the Eagle S ship has gone to trial in October. They were charged with, or they were trialed for cutting the S-Link 2 telecommunication cable linking Finland and Estonia. But it turned out that, it's international waters. They don't have jurisdiction to necessarily put them in prison, if you will, or charge them with the crime. But still, it was very clear that they recognized, or Estonia, Finland, the countries in the Baltic Basin recognized that this was actually Russia perpetrating these sabotage attempts. The problem is with bringing all the other NATO countries on the same side and, kind of collectively agreeing that on a political level, this is what is happening, and this is intentional, and this is warfare against Russia, which I think at this point no one is really willing to do, and potentially rightfully so, because as I said, nobody wants to be at war with Russia, and we are not at that stage yet to begin with anyway.
Well, I think there are different definitions of war today. Many which are completely which are not hot war as we traditionally describe it. Susanna, as always, thank you so much for laying that out. Pleasure to have you, as always.
Thank you very much.
Come and see us again soon.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Pleasure. And that brings us to the end of this episode of News in Depth. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.